Welcome to Read Aloud with Dan Simpson. I'm Dan Simpson. Today on Read Aloud, we'll be reading from Chapter 1 of Marxism and the National Question by Joseph Stalin, written in 1913. We may read Chapter 2 as well. Welcome in. Thanks for doing the reading. If you like my content, and if you want to support, and if you have a couple dollars laying around, feel free to support. Don't feel obligated, but feel free to help out a comrade. We're going to read from Chapter 1 today as Stalin lays out his theory of the nation and nationality. This is his foremost work of Marxist theoretical work, I think is fair to say. And it is really a truly important contribution to Marxism at a time when these questions were needing answers. And the Georgian, Joseph Stalin, or what is his name? It's Josip Yugashvili. Then he started going by K. Stalin, or Koba Stalin, I believe. That's how he signed it. This work as Stalin. True man of steel, a true man, a man truly steeled in Marxist theory. Okay, so let's get into this. Happy to be with you all today. If you're in chat live, feel free to let me know your thoughts as we read. What feedback do you have? What questions do you have? What are you getting out of this that you didn't get perhaps the first time you read this? What are you thinking? Here we go. Let's read and think together and see what we can get out of this. And away we go. Chapter 1, The Nation. What is a nation? A nation is primarily a community, a definite community of people. This community is not racial, nor is it tribal. The modern Italian nation was formed by Romans, Teutons. I'm going to butcher some, I don't care. Teutons, is that how you say it? Etruscans, Greeks, Arabs, and so forth. The French nation was formed from Gauls, Romans, Britons, Teutons, I don't know, and so on. How do you say that? The same must be said of the British, the Germans, and others, who were formed into nations from people of diverse races and tribes. Thus, a nation is not a racial or tribal, but a historically constituted community of people. There you go. Never ask a woman her age, a man how much he makes, or a communist the real name of revolutionaries. Yeah, did I just dead name the guy? All right, yes, nice. Welcome in. Love your face, comrade. In it fine. On the other hand, reading on, it is unquestionable that the great empires of Cyrus and Alexander could not be called nations, although they came to be constituted historically and were formed out of different tribes and races. They were not nations, but casual and loosely connected conglomerations of groups, Cyrus, which fell apart or joined together according to the victories or defeats of this or that conqueror. Thus, a nation is not a casual or ephemeral conglomeration, but a stable community of people. But not every stable community constitutes a nation. Austria and Russia are also stable communities, but nobody calls them nations. What distinguishes a national community from a state community? The fact, among others, that a national community is inconceivable without a common language, while a state need not have a common language. The Czech nation in Austria and the Polish in Russia would be impossible if each did not have a common language. Whereas the integrity of Russia and Austria is not affected by the fact that there are a number of different languages within their borders. We are referring, of course, to the spoken languages of the people and not to the official governmental languages. Thus, a common language is one of the characteristic features of a nation. This, of course, does not mean that different nations always and everywhere speak different languages, or that all who speak one language necessarily constitute one nation. A common language for every nation, but not necessarily different languages for different nations. He's got to spell this out for the dummies. There is no nation which at one and the same time speaks several languages. But this does not mean that there cannot be two nations speaking the same language. Englishmen and Americans speak one language, but they do not constitute one nation. The same is true of the Norwegians and the Danes, the English and the Irish. But why, for instance, do the English and the Americans not constitute one nation in spite of their common language? Well, firstly, because they do not live together, but inhabit different territories. A nation is formed only as a result of lengthy and systematic intercourse, wink, as a result of people living together generation after generation. But people cannot live together for lengthy periods unless they have a common territory. Englishmen and Americans originally inhabited the same territory, England, and constituted one nation. Later, one section of the English emigrated from England to a new territory, America, and there, in the new territory, in the course of time, came to form the new American nation. Difference of territory led to the formation of different nations. Thus, a common territory is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Yeah, I know. Will it kill him to mention indigenous peoples? The Eurocentrism does suck. Yeah. Absolutely. That is disappointing. But, no one's perfect. Except me. But this, reading on, is not all. Common territory does not by itself create a nation. I love how he always just spells it out. Okay. He just answers the dummies' questions that, he's like, all right, stop typing in chat. I know what you're about to say. Shut up. And then he covers it. Common territory does not itself create a nation. This requires, in addition, an internal economic bond to weld the various parts of the nation into a single whole. Yeah. There's no such bond between England and America, and so they constitute two different nations. But the Americans themselves would not deserve to be called a nation were not the different parts of America bound together into an economic whole as a result of division of labor between them, the development of means of communication, and so forth. Take the Georgians, for instance. Of course, Stalin is Georgian. The Georgians before the reform inhabited a common territory and spoke one language. Nevertheless, they did not, strictly speaking, constitute one nation, for being split up into a number of disconnected principalities, they could not share a common economic life. For centuries, they waged war against each other and pillaged each other, each inciting the Persians and Turks against the other. The ephemeral and casual union of the principalities, which some successful kings sometimes managed to bring about, embraced at best a superficial administrative sphere, and rapidly disintegrated owing to the caprices of the princes and the indifference of the peasants. Nor could it be otherwise in economically disunited Georgia. Georgia came on the scene as a nation only in the latter half of the 19th century, when the fall of serfdom and the growth of the economic life of the country, the development of means of communication, and the rise of capitalism introduced division of labor between the various districts of Georgia, completely shattered the economic isolation of the principalities, and bound them together into a single whole. The same must be said of the other nations which have passed through the stage of feudalism and have developed capitalism. Thus, a common economic life, economic cohesion, is one of the characteristic features of a nation. How are we doing so far, chat? Easy enough to understand, I think. Yeah, I love that. Use your second read of the text. You're getting even more the second time around. Yeah, that happens. That totally happens for many different reasons. And that's why I'm a big proponent of rereading. Reading on. But even this is not all. Apart from the foregoing, one must take into consideration the specific spiritual complexion of the people constituting a nation. Nations differ not only in their conditions of life, but also in spiritual complexion, which manifests itself in peculiarities of national culture. In England, America, and Ireland, which speak one language, generally I get whatever, nevertheless constitute three distinct nations. It is in no small measure due to the peculiar psychological makeup which they developed from generation to generation as a result of dissimilar conditions of existence. Of course, by itself, psychological makeup, or as it is otherwise called, national character, is something intangible for the observer, but insofar as it manifests itself in a distinctive culture common to the nation, it is something tangible and cannot be ignored. Needless to say, national character is not a thing that is fixed once and for all, but is modified by changes in the conditions of life. But since it exists at every given moment, it leaves its impression on the physiognomy of the nation. I love that. Thus, Thus, a common psychological makeup, which manifests itself in a common culture, is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Then he pauses here before he puts it all together as a final master definition. And he says, we have now exhausted the characteristic features of a nation. I think that you know what, we'll have to find out. But he does like sort of update his theory later in his life. He writes this in 1913. I believe in 1914, Lenin comes out with his work on the national question. Yeah, in regards to the nation and nationality. I believe so. I believe his thoughts evolve on the topic because he writes this in 1913, and he goes through a lot of stuff, and they learn a lot, you know. And again, Lenin comes out with his work, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, which I think takes this and clarifies it a lot. And then I think later on, Stalin returns to the topic and makes some amendments. So we'll find out what those are. I think I'd like to follow up this work with those works and sort of stay on the topic of the nation. It's just so foundational. National self-determination is so goddamn foundational. It just goes to explain so much about what's happening in the world, you know, geopolitics or whatever. It's insane. So, like, I'm happy to sort of stick with this topic and then continue on in the reading list. But let's continue reading here. Here is his master definition. That's what I'm thinking, Comrade Charmander. Yeah, exactly. Here's his definition here. You can write this down. And of course, when we look at other works, we'll definitely compare, you know, any changes in definition or whatever to this, which is, he says, we've now exhausted the characteristic features of a nation. He says, a nation, by the way, it's not a state. You've all made that connection, right? A nation is not a state. A state is not necessarily a nation. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Just have there. There it is. It ties into all modern events. That's the thing. It's just nuts, right? It ties into like every modern event that's based on an oppressor nation and you know, and an oppressed nation. All of it. All of it. Absolutely. That's the thing. It all boils down to this. What a nation should be, it all boils down to national self-determination is what I'm saying. It all boils down to it. National self-determination is fundamentally at odds with imperialism, which is fundamentally about exporting capital and dominating another nation with your capital. Anyways, all right, let's keep reading. It goes without saying that a nation, like every historical phenomenon, is subject to the law of change, has its history, its beginning and end. That's right. That's dialectical materialism, baby. You just love to see it. Shit. I was saying that's dialectical materialism, baby.
Thesis and antithesis. The conflict is inevitable.
Oh, hold on. Before we move on, I thought this would help drive the point home. Love Island does not have the right to exist as a state with equal rights for all. And if you understand that reference, you're way too online. Nations of people have a right to exist with equal rights. Love Island is not a nation. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Love Island is not a stable community. So I hope that helps drive the point home for you. See what I mean? It all comes down to this. It all boils down to the right of nations to national self-determination. Except Love Island. Love Island is an oppressor nation. Oppressor nations can never be free. Okay. Again, every nation has its beginning and end. Get over it. Every nation changes. Get over it. Oh, you don't like when your national character changes? Oh, get a life. It's going to happen. Sorry, not sorry. All right, let's read on. It must be emphasized that none of the above characteristics taken separately is sufficient to define a nation, as he covered before. More than that, it is sufficient for a single one of these characteristics to be lacking or missing, and the nation ceases to be a nation. Welcome in, comrade. It is possible to conceive of people possessing a common national character who, nevertheless, cannot be said to constitute a single nation if they are economically disunited, inhabit different territories, speak different languages, and so forth. Such, for instance, are the Russian, Galician, American, Georgian, and Caucasian Highland Jews, who, in our opinion, do not constitute a single nation. He's already calling out Zionism. It is possible to conceive of people with a common territory and economic life who nevertheless would not constitute a single nation because they have no common language and no common national character. Such, for instance, are the Germans and Lets in the Baltic region. What the fuck's a Let? I don't care, whatever. Finally, the Norwegians and the Danes speak one language, but they do not constitute a single nation owing to the absence of the other characteristics. He says, it is only when all these characteristics are present together that we have a nation. It might appear that national character is not one of the characteristics, but the sole essential characteristic of a nation, and that all the other characteristics are, properly speaking, only conditions for the development of a nation, rather than its characteristics. Such, for instance, is the view held by R. Springer, and more particularly by O. Bauer, who were social democratic theoreticians on the national question, well known in Austria. Let us examine their theory of the nation. According to Springer, a nation is a nation is a union of similarly thinking and similarly speaking persons. It is a cultural community of modern people no longer tied to the soil. Our italics. Joseph Stalin. Thus, a union of similarly thinking and similarly speaking people, no matter how disconnected they may be, no matter where they live, is a nation. Bauer goes even further. What is a nation? I'm sorry. It is a common Is it a common language which makes people a nation? But the English and Irish speak the same language without, however, being one people. The Jews have no common language and are yet a nation. What then is a nation? A nation is a relative community of character. But what is character? In this case, national character. National character is the sum total of characteristics which distinguish the people of one nationality from the people of another nationality. The complex of physical and spiritual characteristics which distinguish one nation from another. Bauer knows, of course, that national character does not drop from the skies, and he therefore adds, a character of people is determined by nothing so much as by their destiny. A nation is nothing but a community with a common destiny, which is determined by the conditions under which the people produce their means of subsistence and distribute the products of their labor. We thus arrive at the most complete, as Bauer calls it, definition of a nation. A nation is an aggregate of people bound into a community of character by a common destiny. We thus have common national character based on a common destiny, but not necessarily connected with a common territory, language, or economic life. But what in that case remains of the nation? What common nationality can there be among people who are economically disconnected, inhabit different territories, and from generation to generation speak different languages? Bauer speaks of the Jews as a nation, although they have no common language. But what common destiny and national cohesion is there, for instance, between the Georgian, Dagestanian, Russian, and American Jews who are completely separated from one another, inhabit different territories, and speak different languages? The above-mentioned Jews undoubtedly lead their economic and political life in common with the Georgians, Dagestanians, Russians, and Americans respectively, and they live in the same cultural atmosphere as these. This is bound to leave a definite impress on their national character. If there is anything common to them left, it is their religion, their common origin, and certain relics of the national character. All this is beyond question. But how can it be seriously maintained that petrified religious rites and fading psychological relics affect the destiny of these Jews more powerfully than the living social, economic, and cultural environment that surrounds them? And it is only on this assumption that it is possible to speak of the Jews as a single nation at all. What then distinguishes Bauer's nation from the mystical and self-sufficient national spirit of the spiritualists? Bauer sets up an impassable barrier between the distinctive feature of nations, national character, and the conditions of their life, divorcing the one from the other. But what is national character, if not a reflection of the conditions of life, a coagulation of impressions derived from environment? How can one limit the matter to national character alone, isolating and divorcing it from the soil that gave rise to it? Further, what indeed distinguished the English nation from the American nation at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, when America was still known as New England? Not national character, of course, for the Americans had originated from England and had brought with them to America not only the English language, but also the English national character, which of course they could not lose so soon. Although, under the influence of the new conditions, they would naturally be developing their own specific character. Yet despite their more or less common character, they at the time already constituted a nation distinct from England. Obviously, New England as a nation differed then from England as a nation, not by its specific national character, or not so much by its national character as by its environment and conditions of life, which were distinct from those of England. I think he's sort of making the point that if you somehow magically grabbed America, so called America, and just jammed it right next to England, despite the fact that they speak similar languages and they have a similar national character, their environment and conditions of life are very different, distinct from those in England. So that would still represent, uh, even if it were like a territory, territories right next to each other, not divided by an ocean, it would still be a distinct nation. Maybe I'm going too far with that, but he says it's therefore clear that there is in fact no single distinguishing characteristic of a nation. There is only a sum total of characteristics, of which, when nations are compared, sometimes one characteristic, national character, sometimes another, language, or sometimes a third, territory, economic conditions, stands out in sharper relief. A nation constitutes the combination of all these characteristics taken together. Bauer's point of view, which identifies a nation with its national character, divorces the nation from its soil and converts it into an invisible, self-contained force. The result is not a living and active nation, but something mystical, intangible, and supernatural. For, I repeat, what sort of nation, for instance, is a Jewish nation which consists of Georgian, Dagestanian, Russian, American, and other Jews, the members of which do not understand each other, since they speak different languages, inhabit different parts of the globe, will never see each other, and will never act together, whether in time of peace or in time of war. Really wonder what he would say about Israel right now, and we're not going to get into Stalin's role in the creation of Israel. We're not going to get into that. Not today. I'm not. He says, we're reading on here. He says, no, it is not for such paper nations that social democracy draws up its national program. Keeping in mind he was still part of the Social Democrats at the time. It can reckon only with real nations which act and move, and therefore insist on being reckoned with. Bauer is obviously confusing nation, which is a historical category, with tribe, which is an ethnographical category. I feel like this is a rabbit hole that we could go down, but I don't want to today. Well, I guess I'll highlight in a different color. However, Bauer himself apparently feels the weakness of his position. While in the beginning of his book, he definitely declares the Jews to be a nation, he corrects himself at the end of the book and states that, in general, capitalist society makes it impossible for them to continue as a nation. By causing them to assimilate with other nations. The reason it appears is that, quote, the Jews have no closed territory of settlement. Whereas the Czechs, who just banned communism or whatever, for instance, have such a territory and, according to Bauer, will survive as a nation. The Czechs. Their president just banned advocacy of communism. Peter Pavel. He looks like a neoliberal Disney character. I mean, he is a handsome guy. He's got a look. Yeah. Balkan Colonel Sanders. Oh, now we're having a good time. All right. So, reading on here. Again, it says the Jews have no closed territory of settlement, whereas the Czechs, for example, have such a territory, and according to Bauer, will survive as a nation. In short, the reason lies in the absence of a territory. By arguing thus, Bauer wanted to prove that the Jewish workers cannot demand national autonomy, but he thereby inadvertently refuted his own theory, which denies that a common territory is one of the characteristics of a nation. But Bauer goes further. In the beginning of his book, he definitely declares that the Jews have no common language and yet are a nation. But hardly has he reached page 130 that he effects a change of front and just as definitely declares that unquestionably no nation is possible without a common language. Our italics. Bauer wanted to prove that language is the most important instrument of human intercourse. Oh, baby. But at the same time, he inadvertently proved something he did not mean to prove, namely, the unsoundness of his own theory of nations, which denies the significance of a common language. Thus, this theory, tied together by idealistic threads, refutes itself. That's such a banger sentence. That is so funny to me. And I believe that brings us to the end of chapter 1. Let's review. What's a nation? Well, it's not racial, it's not tribal. It's a historically constituted community of people. It's not a casual or ephemeral conglomeration, but a stable community of people. A common language is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Remember, we're not confusing nation for state. A common territory is one of the characteristic features of a nation. A common economic life, one of the characteristic features of a nation. Common psychological makeup, which manifests itself in a common culture, is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Thus, Stalin's 1913 definition, so-called definition of a nation, is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. It's only when all these characteristics are present together that we have a nation. A nation constitutes the combination of all these characteristics taken together. And that is chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed reading that with me. If you did, feel free to support my content. A couple different ways you can do that. You can subscribe on Twitch. You can support via Patreon. You could send a tip. And all of that helps and is very helpful, and it means a lot. Thank you. And thanks for listening. Appreciate that. If you're listening to a replay, check out the next chapter. Chapter 2. On Marxism and the National Question. Chapter 2, the National Movement. The National Movement. think he starts to really pick up speed here in chapter 2. It gets good. Starts really making sense here. And I'm looking forward